You can't improve what you don't measure. Tracking activities and results that drive business equals bottom line improvement. This is the focus of today's Van University webinar with vehicle acquisition founder Tom Gregg and special guest Greg Churchill, president of Honda West in Calgary. Today is November 16th. I'm Ryan Girardi. Thank you for joining us. Folks, Greg has been benefiting from the Vehicle Acquisition Network for about 6 months now, and he's developed quickly into becoming one of the most insightful and advanced users. And part of his success is the culture of tracking activities and making appropriate changes based on results. It's been a model that has permitted them to scale and help other dealers in their 20 group. So in a few moments, I'm going to turn things over to Tom, who will cover different elements of the tracking activities within a buy center. And then we'll ask Greg to elaborate on his philosophy of tracking activity and running his buy center. So with that being said, gentlemen, Tom, welcome back. And Greg, welcome to Van University.
Thanks, Ryan. So as you'd indicated about 6 months ago, Greg started using Vehicle Acquisition Network. And we were surprised at the advancement and progress that the company had done and how insightful they were with how to use the software and to acquire a lot of cars. And I'll let Greg share some of the stats, as he would know them better than I would. But they're in the top tier of dealers that we work with. And it stems from a lot of things. You mentioned about the company culture, that they use the data to make improvements. And so it allows them to be very subjective and focus on the stats. And from there, they make appropriate changes. And what was, I think, most impressive wasn't just that they focus on their own store, is that they're part of a 20 group that seems almost more like a brotherhood than it is a 20 group, where they actually help each other, and they even travel to one of their stores to make sure that they are helping the other members of the group and helping everybody drive results. So with that, I've been very impressed with the relationship that we bonded. And so I thought today was an appropriate day to discuss how to take the metrics of the performance in your acquisition or buying department and use the stats to make changes. And as you'd indicated in the opening, was to drive bottom line results. So I would like to get in shortly to the why, so why you should do this. And then after that, discuss the metrics that you use to determine what success is. And then I'll let Greg to kind of dig in deeper and how he uses the numbers to make those changes, not only in his company, but also in the ones that he is affiliated through with his groups. So as you had started, kind of the why. So I've heard many times Dale Pollack and other speakers discuss that you can't improve something that you do not measure. And it's so true, because if you are not looking at numbers and understanding where you're currently at, how would you possibly know if you're on the right track to get to where you're going? So if you think about a map, if you don't know where you're currently at on the map, it's hard to determine where you're actually going and if you are in the right direction to get there, or if you're just zigzagging left and right as opposed to on a straight line to help you achieve your end goal as fast as possible. So I've shared a little bit about my feelings about why you should track some of the metrics. Greg, I'm sure you have a lot of insight into this. So would you share some of the other reasons why you track the metrics that you do?
Absolutely, Tom. Basically, when we took a look at the activity around buying vehicles, I think our philosophy always within the dealership is that you need to have well laid out, well thought out processes, regardless of what you're doing. So when we started to really get serious about acquiring vehicles privately, and a lot of that was investing in the van software, we took a look at it, I guess, through the same lens. So the whole concept really is treat it, almost like you would treat a separate department. So in order to do that, first of all, figure out, find out what you feel are some of the best processes. From there, lay out some performance metrics. And obviously, most importantly, is accurately measuring those performance metrics. So what it allows us to do on a go-forward basis, if we fall off in terms of our ultimate performance, which is trying to acquire more used cars, we can look back and perhaps figure out where we fell down, We can do things like A/B test and try a slightly different process to see if that improves our results as well.
That's great. Yeah. And so as we discussed this morning, so we're making small tweaks and changes to your organization. And so by having the metrics of where you've been, we can now look back over the next week or two to see if the small tweaks and changes have had a positive impact or not.
Absolutely.
That's
yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So, and kind of what Greg had touched on. So, what to fix and where to look. So, and he commented on those in detail about, if there is something that is sliding off, you can then look back to see, where there is an opportunity to improve, and having that historical data allows you really to know where to dig in. Great. And so I think that the meat of the conversation today would be more around, what data to look at. And then once you understand what data to look at and what data to track, what you do with that information. So if you can go on to the next section, Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on through. Great. So my background is e-commerce. So if you can open up the what metrics to track. Being the director of e-commerce overlooking a BDC, it was all about the appointments, the shows, and the acquisitions. So this relates in depth quite well to that. So for those dealers that are familiar with that model of a BDC and tracking that in detail and those metrics that go along with it, it's a little bit different in the acquisition space. First of all, we're looking at text messages that are going out, the conversion rate of text messages that are coming in, the answer rate, and that's related to phone calls. So are the phones being answered? And then from there, once you are communicating with private sellers, what is your rate of appointments? What is your rate of individuals that are showing up? And what is your rate of acquisitions? And so this is kind of what I consider to be kind of the baseline metrics, kind of what you would begin looking at and kind of tracking the success, tracking the results. And then over the course of time, as you make changes, are those results having a positive or negative impact? And are your results consistent with what a standard should be based on your process and your people? So I would like for Greg to comment. Greg, I know you track some things beyond this, but if you wouldn't mind just talking about these points, as well as what other metrics you track beyond this.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. As you showed up there, we're basically taking a look at how many texts we send out using the software. The software provides how many engagements, and by engagements, what we mean there is just basically the customer responds. From there, as soon as a customer responds, our process is to effectively create a prospect within our CRM tool. And from there, we can measure the rest of the activity. So obviously the big one after engagement is appointments. We're trying to drive to a 40% appointment ratio from there. Our results have been typically in that 30 to 40% range. Obviously, the next thing, once we've actually have an appointment with the customer, and we're using all this, it's really the same best practices that you'd use in any BDC. So we're offering rather than asking the customer whether they'd like to come in, we're offering two options. We're making sure the customer knows where we're at. We're asking them to contact us if for whatever reason they're unable to make the appointment, and we're also doing a manager confirmation call. From there, we take a look at shows, very similar to BDC metrics. We're right around that 60% show ratio as long as we maintain the manager confirmation call. And from there, we track our closing ratio. So we're looking at about on first time appointments, we're looking at about a 15% closing ratio. Interestingly, where it really diverges from floor traffic, which obviously would convert at a much higher rate, if we can drive B-backs, so if we can drive a customer back in the second time, we end up closing around 95%. So really a lot of the focus of the BDC becomes around the follow-up. And although they don't, customer may not close the first time, really the gold in the program is really continuing our follow-up process, following our call guides, whether the customer came in and didn't buy, whether they made an appointment and didn't show, or whether we couldn't even get an appointment with them. We have very specific call guides, so we're contacting those customers, or trying to contact them at specific intervals, really for about 45 days. And from there, that drives a lot of be-back activity, because a lot of times when the customer comes in and even makes the appointment, they're just not ready to buy yet. They just haven't felt enough pain of trying to sell their own vehicle privately yet. But if we can create a positive experience for them when they do come in, they are receptive to our follow-up, and a lot of them eventually come back and sell us their vehicle. So that's sort of the step one in terms of our metrics tracking. We also took a look at step two, which is what happens when the customer actually comes in. So again, similar to when a customer comes in to buy a vehicle, we thought it'd be prudent to really develop a buying process for us that we can follow, that we can train our acquisition specialists on. So again, very similar to the road to the sale, we call it the road to a buy. So some of the things we track there are obviously greeting, which is pretty standard. But when the customer arrives, one of the things we like to do first is present our process and talk about how that works. Did we demo the customer's vehicle? Very little credibility if we're appraising a car without driving it. Did we go to our worksheet presentation? For that, we're using basically the same presentation we do on a customer's trade-in. We happen to use vAuto for that. So we're talking about what vehicles similar to theirs are transacting in the marketplace, showing them a market value report, and then explaining where we get our value based upon those numbers as a starting point. Our expectation is also that the next step would be obviously presentation of the numbers, management turnover. If we're not successful, or even if we are successful in acquiring the vehicle from the customer, we want every customer to meet a manager, just like we do on the sales floor. And then obviously the last metric is closing ratio. Because we have more than one acquisition specialist or buyer, we can track these metrics, take a look how they're performing versus each other, dial in, take a look at if they're missing a step, just like we would a salesperson.
Gregg, I have a couple questions for you based on you're talking a lot about tracking, the things you track, the metrics. How often are you finding, you can see performance. So how often are you finding things underperforming and have to make adjustments? And maybe on the inverse, how often are you finding things really clicking and working and maybe, do more of that or hone in on it? Can you give examples of that?
Well, I mean, I think the whole exercise that, as Tom mentioned, it is fairly new to us. So I think we struggle initially with just knowing what our expectations should be. But now that we've got about, 6 months of data, we can certainly focus in on what is working, what isn't, what's happening this month versus last month. Probably a prime example, and when I've worked with some other dealers in Canada on how they're performing and where they're falling short, as long as they're tracking the same metrics, it's very easy to dial in on that. So a great example of that was I was working with a dealer in my performance group, and their engagement was good. They just weren't able to generate appointments. So from there, the next step that we took was to pull up their van reporting and actually listen to their BDC reps on the phone. And it became really apparent where the shortfall was there was just in the word tracks. They were deviating from the word tracks. They weren't saying the things conducive to actually getting an appointment. So by having the metrics, it allowed us to dial in right
Sure.
away, on what the shortfall was.
Good. Now, Tom, something that might be, I think, useful for the audience watching this is you mentioned that Gregg and his team are relatively new to the Van family and the tool. What happens between the client, the partner relationship between you two, and Tom, that you can find that's different, that stands out for you, in contrast to some of your other relationships where maybe there are obstacles that you're not able to overcome like you are with Gregg?
Yeah, I'd say the collaboration. So simply the way that Gregg collaborates and is very eager to help, very eager to dig in and help others succeed as well. So being very selfless. So it's remarkable. So we really appreciate the generosity to be able to learn from what he's doing, learn from his mistakes, learn from his successes, and be able to help others advance and reduce that learning curve.
And how do you see his success? What shows up on your side that indicates, wow, Gregg's team is really, really improving,
Sure.
rapidly?
Yeah.
What do you see? What's the indicator?
Yeah, and I would say we have limited visibility into pure success, but other than feedback. So what Gregg has shared back is that he's set records, and I'll let Gregg speak about the records he's setting.
Mm-hmm.
But when I hear September was a record month in sales and record number of cars acquired, October record sales again and record number of cars acquired. October, same. So if you have 3 months in a row where you're setting records in sales because you now have a set of inventory that you didn't previously have or have access to efficiently, that for me is motivating, it's inspiring, and it helps us to feel good about what we're doing because we're helping a business owner that is helping his team succeed and do things that they previously didn't have the tools at their disposal to be able to do so as they do now. So they have to put the work in, but we're happy to provide the tools to help them to be great. So Gregg, if you wouldn't mind sharing on some of the stats that you've shared with me about your acquisitions and about some of the records you're setting.
Yeah, absolutely. When we sign up on Van, I think the excitement for us in terms of what the potential of what the software would help us do was, obviously acquiring a lot more vehicles. Like pretty much every other dealership in North America, we always felt that our only limitation to growth in the used car department was the ability to acquire more used vehicles. Other than trade-ins, we can all go to the auction and be the last dummy with his hand up. But the reality is that doesn't work for many people. So we would typically have a really big month in the used car department, but we depleted our inventory. And so the next month was kind of mediocre, and it's really all inventory driven. We launched in May. Really didn't know what we had, and recognized very quickly that this was quite the opportunity to be consistent in acquiring inventory, and obviously very consistent in terms of how many vehicles we're able to sell. So just to give you some context, we were a dealership that typically sold somewhere around 50 to 60 used vehicles a month. Since we signed on to Van and really got it going, July, August, September, and October, we've been consistently acquiring anywhere from about 55 to 70 used vehicles through our buying center. We thought we were doing a pretty good job before we had the software, and when we were acquiring from private customers, anywhere from 5 to 6 vehicles a month. So it was quite a radical change. All of a sudden, we didn't need to go to the auction and overpay for vehicles that didn't really work on our lot anyways. And we've actually been able to become selective and are actually even wholesaling some vehicles because we've got that many great vehicles available to us. So obviously that that translated into increased sales. as well. And so we've been consistently in the 90 per month retail over those months as well. So we feel moving forward, into 2018 as we get even better within our department. We hope to be averaging over 100 retail a month. So, which is significant for us in the context of we're small dealership on a small, less than 2-acre lot. We got room for about 65, 70 vehicles on the lot at any given time. So we're turning our inventory right around between 20 and 25 days in the used car department, and really it's big success story for us and a real game changer.
And are some of the practices that you've instilled, is it because you brought in the van technology, or were you already implementing these practices and you're like, we need to get more cars in here? Or is it a combination maybe of both?
Yeah, it was a happy coincidence in when we signed up, when we kind of discovered the van software. We'd kind of decided to go down this road anyways, but it was really going to be a very manual process of going through the used car listings. And I think every dealer has played with that. But then, of course, the dealership gets busy, and it was usually salespeople doing that. So we'd actually hired somebody for that specific purpose, and along with a BDC agent. And we were having a little bit of success, but we'd only been at it for 2 or 3 weeks when we quite literally stumbled upon the software, and have really been able to, for it to take off from there. I mean, I guess my advice with respect to acquiring used vehicles is, you really need to treat it as a separate process. You need to think it through. You need to staff it accordingly. I think the big mistake would be to not have enough horsepower and bandwidth to have very specific people who are focused specifically on this activity and aren't trying to sell cars or aren't trying to do something else. I think that's really the key to success.
And Tom, that's something we cover all the time, is you got to build your acquisition team. And, much like a BDC, you have your own processes, your own metrics. So you can, as you've said, Gregg, is see the performance of things through time. Thanks again, Gregg, Tom, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to go ahead and turn things off, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, guys.